May 15, 1945. 0930 hours. Glucksburg Castle, 3 kilometers north of Finnsburg, Germany. The morning was crisp and clear. Through the castle windows, Paul Nitze could see the Flensburg fjord in the distance, its waters serene despite the turmoil that had engulfed Europe for 6 years. He sat across a wooden table from the man who had kept Nazi Germany's war machine operational for 3 years while Allied bombs rained down on every major industrial city in the Reich. Albert Speer was 40 years old, impeccably attired in a tailored suit despite being a prisoner of war. He sat with his hands folded on the table, posture straight, expression composed, almost relaxed. There was no swagger, no defiance, only a quiet calculation behind his eyes. Nitze was 38, a former Wall Street investment banker who had traded high finance for government service when his mentor, James Forrestal, called him to Washington in 1940. Now he was vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. He had one question that mattered above all others. But first, he needed Speer to trust him or at least believe that cooperation would serve his interests better than silence. The war in Europe had ended 8 days earlier. On May 7, Germany had signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender at Reims, France. Adolf Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker. On April 30, as Soviet artillery pounded the streets above, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, Hitler's designated successor, had formed what he optimistically called a government in Flensburg, appointed Speer as Minister of Armaments and Production, and pretended Germany still existed as a sovereign nation. It did not. Germany was a corpse. The question now was what lessons the living could extract from examining that corpse before its enemies divided the remains among themselves. American forces arrived in Flensburg on May 15. The race to interrogate Speer was over. Nitze got there first. The United Nations War Crimes Commission wanted Speer in chains, wanted him tried alongside Göring and the other Nazi leaders, but Nitze needed him talking first. The Pacific War was still raging. American bombers were striking Japanese cities with the same relentless fury they had unleashed on Germany. Tokyo had burned. Osaka had burned. Nagoya had burned. But no one knew if it would work, if strategic bombing alone could compel Japan to surrender without the nightmare of a ground invasion. Estimates for invading the Japanese home islands predicted 500,000 American casualties, perhaps more. Strategic bombing had to succeed. It had to force capitulation without American soldiers fighting through every city, village, and mountain fortress that Japanese commanders would defend to the last man. But first, the Americans needed to understand what had actually worked against Germany. And only one man in the world held the complete answer: Speer. Nitze had been pursuing this interrogation for weeks. The Strategic Bombing Survey had been established in November 1944 by Secretary of War Henry Stimson, following a directive from President Franklin Roosevelt. The mission was straightforward on paper: determine the effect of strategic bombing on Germany's war-making capability, document successes and failures, and use those lessons in the Pacific. Nitze had assembled a formidable team. John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist who would later become famous as a Harvard professor and best-selling author, sat in the room with him at Glucksburg. George Ball, future Under-Secretary of State in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, had been leading teams across Germany for months, examining bombed factories, interviewing shell-shocked industrialists, and studying production records salvaged from facilities reduced to rubble by Allied bombs. But Speer was the prize, the keystone that would make sense of all the other interviews, documents, and bomb damage assessments. Speer had overseen the entire German war economy since February 1942, when he took over the Ministry of Armaments following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in an aircraft accident. For 3 years, Speer had controlled every factory, supply chain, and labor allocation decision from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow. If anyone knew whether strategic bombing had worked, whether it had crippled German production or merely inconvenienced it, whether the entire costly campaign had been worth the loss of aircraft and crews, it was Speer. The problem was that Speer knew his own value. He had observed other Nazi leaders in the final weeks of the war. Some had committed suicide like Hitler in Goebbels. Some had fled and were being hunted like animals. Some had been captured and were already slated for trial. Speer had carefully calculated his odds. His name was not as infamous as Göring's or Himmler's. He had not delivered speeches calling for extermination. He had not run concentration camps. He was the technocrat, the architect, the production genius who had kept Germany fighting longer than anyone thought possible. If he played this correctly, if he made himself indispensable to the Americans, if he revealed what they wanted to know about strategic bombing, perhaps they would shield him from the hangman's noose. Perhaps they would tell the prosecutors at Nuremberg that Speer had been cooperative, had been different from the others, and had aided the Allied cause by explaining what had worked and what had not. It was a calculated risk, but Speer was a man who understood calculations. He had already decided his strategy before Nitze asked the first question: full cooperation, total transparency. He would reveal everything the Americans wanted to know about German war production, the effects of strategic bombing, Hitler's final days, the collapse of the Reich's economy, everything except the one subject that could get him hanged: his knowledge of and complicity in the Holocaust. That topic was forbidden territory. Speer would maintain that he had been too absorbed in production to comprehend the full scope of the atrocities in the camps. He would claim ignorance while taking responsibility for Germany's defeat in the abstract. It was a tightrope to walk, but Speer believed he could manage it. Nitze understood this calculation immediately. He could see it in how Speer leaned forward slightly when questions touched on technical matters of production and bombing effectiveness. He could see how Speer's expression closed down like a vault door slamming shut whenever topics approached moral questions. Nitze made a tactical decision. He would ask about factories, not atrocities, about production numbers. Not slave labor, about bomb damage to industrial plants, not extermination. Camps. Get the information the survey needed. Leave the war crimes questions for the prosecutors at Nuremberg, who would interrogate Speer in a courtroom with judges and evidence and penalties. Nitze's job was narrower and more immediate. Figure out what strategic bombing accomplished. Use that knowledge to end the war in the Pacific before more Americans died. For 7 days from May 15 through May 21, Nitze and his team questioned Speer 5 hours per day, sometimes extending into the evening when Speer was particularly forthcoming. Each morning, Speer would arrive at the interrogation room in that same well-ted suit, pleasant, cooperative, occasionally offering insights and documents the Americans had not even thought to request. He walked them through what he called bombing high school, the education of conquerors and how a nation survives and ultimately fails to survive under total air war. Speer began with the production statistics, the numbers that had made him famous in the Nazi hierarchy as the miracle worker who kept the war machine running. When he took over the Armaments Ministry in February 1942, Germany was producing approximately 15,000 aircraft per year. By 1944, production had reached 39,087 aircraft, tank and self-propelled gun. Production had climbed from approximately 4,900 in 1941 to around 27,000 in 1944. Ammunition production had more than doubled. Artillery pieces, submarines, trucks, small arms, all showed similar dramatic increases. The armaments miracle, they called it. Speer's organizational genius had supposedly kept Germany in the war years longer than economic fundamentals suggested was possible. Nitze listened to these figures with intense concentration, taking careful notes. The numbers were impressive. They were also confusing. Something fundamental did not add up, and Nitze needed to understand the discrepancy. Germany had been under sustained Allied bombing since May 1942 when the Royal Air Force launched its first 1,000-bomber raid, hitting Cologne with unprecedented force. American daylight precision bombing had joined the campaign in August 1942 when the 8th Air Force flew its first mission against rail yards in occupied France. By mid-1943, the combined bomber offensive was hitting German cities and industrial facilities around the clock. RAF Bomber Command flew night area raids designed to destroy residential areas, kill workers, and break civilian morale. The United States Army Air Forces flew daylight precision raids targeting specific industrial facilities. Ball bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries, rail yards, submarine pens. Tens of thousands of bombers had dropped millions of tons of explosives on Germany. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden had been turned into funeral pyres. Berlin was a landscape of rubble. Yet German production had tripled under Speer's leadership. How? Nitze wanted to understand the mechanism. How does an industrial economy under systematic bombardment increase its output by 300%? What were the Germans doing that allowed factories to keep running despite having high explosive and incendiary bombs falling on them night and day? Speer explained the defensive measures in detail, speaking like a professor lecturing students. Dispersal of production, moving critical manufacturing to small workshops scattered across the countryside where bombers were unlikely to find them. Transfer of entire facilities to underground locations, converted mines, railway tunnels, anywhere that offered protection from bombs, ruthless prioritization of resources, cutting civilian production to zero to free up materials and labor for war goods. Redundancy in supply chains, ensuring that if one factory was destroyed, others could increase output to compensate. Improved industrial processes developed by German engineers working under the pressure of constant bombing, streamlining of aircraft and tank designs to reduce the number of parts, simplify assembly, speed up production, exploitation of forced labor from occupied territories. Millions of workers brought to Germany against their will to replace German men conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Speer made it sound almost reasonable, clinical, a problem of logistics and management that he had solved through administrative competence and organizational innovation. He spoke about production lines and labor allocation, the way a man might discuss optimizing a facto's efficiency during peacetime. There was no mention of the conditions those forced laborers endured. The starvation, the beatings, the deaths in the factories and camps, just numbers on charts showing output increases. But then Speer mentioned something that made Nitze stop writing and look up from his notes. A date, May 12, 1944. Speer said he would never forget that date. On that day, 935 American heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force struck German synthetic oil production facilities in central and eastern Germany in the largest concentrated attack on petroleum infrastructure executed up to that point in the war. The primary target was the Luna synthetic oil plant near Mersburg, Germany's single largest producer of aviation gasoline. Other major facilities at pits near Stettin Brucks in occupied Czechoslovakia, Ballin, Zitz, and Lewetzkendorf also took heavy damage. Speer said that attack changed everything. Until May 12, Germany had managed to produce approximately as many weapons as the armed forces needed despite considerable losses to Allied bombing. After May 12, everything began to collapse. The armaments miracle was over. The war was effectively lost, though it would take another 11 months of fighting and hundreds of thousands more deaths before Germany surrendered. Nitze made careful notes. This was the critical insight he had come to find. Not tanks, not aircraft, not ball bearings, oil, fuel, the substance that made every weapon system mobile and operational. Speer continued, and the story became even more stark. After the May attacks on oil production, Germany's monthly output of synthetic fuel dropped catastrophically. In April 1944, Germany had produced 316,000 tons of aviation, gasoline, and other petroleum products. By July, production had fallen to 107,000 tons. By September, it had collapsed to less than 50,000 tons. The attacks continued. American heavy bombers returned to the synthetic oil plants again and again. Whenever German workers repaired damage and restarted production, more bombers arrived. The refineries became the most Heavily defended targets in Germany, ringed with anti-aircraft guns, protected by fighter squadrons, diverted from other fronts. Nothing helped. The Americans kept coming. By December 1944, German fuel production was what Speer called catastrophic. The Luftwaffe could not fly. Pilot training, already reduced to dangerously low hours, was curtailed further because there was not enough gasoline to keep training. Aircraft airborne. New fighter squadrons received aircraft but sat on the ground for lack of fuel. German jet fighters. The Me-262 that was technologically superior to any Allied fighter was produced in substantial numbers but could not be deployed effectively because there was not enough fuel for training pilots to fly them or for operational squadrons to sustain combat missions. Panzer divisions could not move. Commanders had to choose between using their limited fuel allocation for training exercises or saving it for combat. Usually, they chose to save it, which meant tank crews went into battle with insufficient training, which meant higher losses, which meant more replacement crews needed more training, which required more fuel that did not exist. It was a death spiral. When Germany launched its final major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, German planners allocated barely enough fuel for the attacking divisions to reach their initial objectives. The operational plan explicitly counted on capturing Allied fuel depots to sustain the offensive beyond the first few days. When that capture failed, when American resistance proved stronger than German intelligence predicted, entire panzer formations ran out of gasoline in the Ardennes forest and had to be abandoned by their crews. Thousands of tanks that had been painstakingly built in dispersed factories that had survived the journey to the front that had functioning guns and trained crews sat emo because there was no fuel to move them. Nitze pressed for more details about other bombing targets. What about the famous raids on Schweinfurt, the city that produced most of Germany's ball bearings? American bombers had hit Schweinfurt twice in 1943, suffering devastating losses. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14 cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers and 600 air crew. Surely that raid, which had targeted such a critical component, had crippled German production. Speer smiled slightly. It was a practiced smile, the kind a teacher might give a student who asks an obvious question. Ball bearings, Speer explained, had never been the bottleneck the Americans believed they were. Germany had stockpiled months of supply before the raids. When production at Schweinfurt dropped, German engineers substituted simpler bearings in applications that did not require high precision. They used sleeve bearings, plain bearings, anything that reduced ball bearing consumption. They imported bearings from Sweden and Switzerland through supply channels that remained open despite the Allied blockade. The attacks on Schweinfurt had cost Germany production capacity. Certainly, but they had not crippled anything, not even close. Meanwhile, those two raids had cost the Americans irreplaceable heavy bombers and experienced crews. From Speer's perspective, Schweinfurt had been a net victory for Germany. What about attacks on transportation networks? The rail system that moved raw materials to factories and finished weapons to the front. Speer conceded this had been increasingly effective, particularly in the final months of the war. By February 1945, the Ruhr industrial region, Germany's manufacturing heartland, was completely isolated from its coal supplies. Finnish tanks could not reach the Eastern Front. Raw materials could not reach factories. But Speer noted that transportation attacks had only become decisive late in the war after Germany was already losing for other reasons. Primarily the fuel crisis that made movement impossible even when rail lines were intact. What about attacks on aircraft production facilities? Speer explained that aircraft production had peaked in 1944 at 3987 planes, the highest of the entire war. How was that possible if Allied bombers were systematically attacking aircraft factories? Speer's answer was devastating in its simplicity. Factories were dispersed. Production was moved to underground facilities. Assembly was broken into smaller steps performed in workshops that were difficult to target. The Germans became extremely efficient at building aircraft. The problem was not production. The problem was fuel. You can build all the fighters you want, Speer said. But if you cannot fuel them, cannot train pilots to fly them, cannot get them to operational airfields, they are useless. Germany produced thousands of aircraft in 1944 that never flew a single combat mission. They sat on airfields or in factories abandoned for lack of fuel and trained pilots. Building an airplane took weeks. Training a pilot took months. Producing the fuel to fly them took refinery capacity that Allied bombers had destroyed. Nitze was beginning to see the pattern emerge. Strategic bombing had not failed. It had succeeded, but only where it targeted the one thing Germany could not replace, could not substitute, could not work around: oil. Everything else Speer had found solutions for. Factories could be moved or rebuilt. Equipment could be repaired. Workers could be replaced with forced labor from occupied territories. Production processes could be streamlined and simplified. But oil was finite. Germany had virtually no natural petroleum reserves. The Reich depended entirely on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into gasoline and diesel through complex chemical processes. When those plants were destroyed, there was no alternative. Romania had provided natural crude oil from the pesty fields until Soviet forces overran Romania in August 1944. After that, Germany was running on whatever synthetic fuel its battered refineries could still produce, and that amount was shrinking with every bombing raid. On the afternoon of May 18, 3 days into the interrogation, Nitze shifted topics. He asked Speer about American industrial capacity. What a German leadership understood about American production capability before the war. What intelligence did they have? What did they believe America could produce? This was where the conversation turned. This was where Nitze began to understand something that went beyond bombing effectiveness, something fundamental about why Germany had lost and why America had won. Speer paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that in the early years of the war from 1939 through 1941, Hitler and the German High Command did not take American industrial capacity seriously. They viewed America as weak, divided, isolationist, still suffering economically from the Great Depression. When President Franklin Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would produce 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943, along with 120,000 tanks in the same period, German military advisors dismissed these figures as propaganda. Impossible numbers, they said. Ridiculous American boasting meant to intimidate Germany and reassure Britain. Hitler agreed with this assessment. He believed the numbers were fantasy. The desperate lies of a weak nation trying to appear strong. The numbers were not fantasy. They were underestimates. By the time Speer took over the Armaments Ministry in February 1942, intelligence reports reaching Berlin suggested American production was far beyond anything Germany could match. Speer requested detailed analysis. What were the Americans actually producing? How much? How quickly could Germany match these rates? The answers that came back were staggering and terrifying. In 1941, the United States had produced approximately 19,000 combat aircraft. In 1942, that number reached roughly 48,000, in 1943, approximately 86,000. In 1944, approximately 96,000. Those were combat aircraft only, not including trainers, transports, and other non-combat types. Speer stopped speaking for a moment. Nitze waited, sensing that something important was coming. Then Speer said the words that Nitze would remember for the rest of his life. He said that when he finally saw the complete American production statistics in late 1943, he understood with absolute certainty that Germany had already lost the war. Not because of any battle or campaign, not because of German strategic errors or tactical failures, but because Germany's industrial capacity was eclipsed by overwhelming American material superiority. There was no scenario, no possible strategy, no wonder-weapon, no tactical brilliance that could overcome such a massive disparity in production. The war was over. Germany would keep fighting because surrender was unthinkable and because Hitler refused to accept reality, but the outcome was already determined by numbers that could not be changed. Nitze asked for more specifics. Speer provided them in detail, speaking with the precision of an accountant reciting a balance sheet. Total American aircraft production from 1941 to 1945 exceeded 300,000 planes. Germany produced approximately 119,000. American tank and self-propelled gun production exceeded 88,000. Germany produced approximately 49,000. The United States built approximately 2,700 major naval vessels, including aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Germany built fewer than 100 major surface warships. But it was not just the absolute quantity that mattered, though that alone was decisive. It was the speed, the rate of production, the staggering pace at which American factories turned out finished weapons. American shipyards were producing Liberty ships, 10,000-ton cargo vessels, faster than German submarines could sink them. In 1942 and 1943, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant vessels at rates that should have strangled Britain's supply lines. Except American shipyards were building replacement vessels faster than U-boat could sink them. By autumn 1943, all Allied shipping losses since the start of the war in 1939 had been replaced. The Atlantic was no longer a graveyard for Allied shipping. It had become a highway for American production flowing to Europe. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan produced B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at a rate of one complete aircraft every 63 minutes. One bomber with more than one and a 500,000 individual parts, rolling off an assembly line every hour, 24 hours per day. A single factory producing the most complex weapon system in the American arsenal with the same efficiency that Ford had produced automobiles. Germany had nothing comparable. German aircraft production was still based on skilled craftsmen carefully assembling components with attention to quality. American production was based on mass manufacturing principles, interchangeable parts, assembly line techniques perfected in the automotive industry. When American automobile companies converted to war production, they brought that expertise with them. Chrysler made aircraft fuselages. General Motors made airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. Packard built Rolls-Royce engines for the British Royal Air Force. Ford made everything from jeeps to bombers. Speer said he had tried to reorganize German industry along American mass production principles. He streamlined tank and aircraft designs, reduced the number of different models being produced simultaneously, pushed for standardization and interchangeable parts. He achieved remarkable production gains. German output tripled under his leadership, but every gain was meaningless. Germany was sprinting on a treadmill. For every increase Speer achieved, American production increased by a larger absolute number. In 1944, Alone, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany's best year was 39,000, the ratio was worse than 2 to 1, and that was just aircraft. The disparity was similar or worse in every other category of military production. But there was something else, something Speer said he had not fully understood until it was too late to matter. America was not just producing weapons for itself. Under the Lend-Lease program authorized by Congress in March 1941, American factories were supplying military equipment to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, Free France, and every other nation fighting the Axis powers. American factories equipped British soldiers, fed Soviet armies, transported Chinese forces. By 1944, American industry was producing approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the war. Britain was a formidable industrial power. The Soviet Union had relocated entire factories east of the Ural Mountains beyond the range of German bombers and was producing enormous quantities of T-34 tanks and IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft. Yet American output exceeded both combined. And America was doing this while simultaneously raising an army of over 12 million men, maintaining a two-ocean navy fighting Germany in the Atlantic and Japan in the Pacific, conducting strategic bombing campaigns in both theaters, preparing the largest amphibious invasion force in history for D-Day in Normandy, and somehow still increasing civilian consumption at home. American gross national product grew by 52% between 1939 and 1944. The war did not impoverish America. It enriched the nation. American factories produced military equipment at rates that seemed impossible, while American citizens bought more consumer goods than they had before the war started. Speer told Nitze that this was what German military intelligence had failed to understand in 1939 when they assessed whether Germany should fear American entry into the war. German analysts saw American isolationism, political divisions, economic problems lingering from the Depression and concluded that the United States would not be a significant factor. Even after Pearl Harbor, when Hitler declared war on America in December 1941, German leadership believed the Japanese would keep American attention focused on the Pacific. They were wrong. America fought a two-front global war and overwhelmed both opponents simultaneously. Nitze asked when German leadership realized the true scale of American production capacity. Speer said, "It became undeniable by mid-1943. That was when the tide turned everywhere. At once. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be built. Submarine construction had been a priority, but American destroyers and aircraft were hunting U-boat with new radar and sonar technology, and American shipyards were replacing every sunk merchant vessel with two new ones. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was using American trucks, American aircraft, American supplies delivered through Murman and Persia to sustain offensives that pushed German forces steadily westward. In North Africa, American forces had landed in Operation Torch with overwhelming material superiority, and German and Italian forces were being compressed between American armies advancing from the west and British armies from the east. In the Pacific, American carrier production meant Japan faced a foe that grew stronger with every passing month, while Japan's own carrier fleet was being systematically destroyed. And over Germany, American bomber formations were appearing in greater numbers every week. 8th Air Force in England, 15th Air Force in Italy. Formations of hundreds of heavy bombers escorted by long-range fighters hitting targets in broad daylight. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to stop them. German fighter production was high. Pilots were initially skilled. New aircraft types like the Me-262 jet fighter showed technological superiority over anything the Allies flew. But there was not enough fuel to fly them in adequate numbers. And even when fuel was available, the sheer weight of American numbers was overwhelming. For every German fighter shot down, the Americans replaced it with multiple new aircraft. German pilot losses could not be replaced. Training required fuel that no longer existed. By 1945, Luftwaffe squadrons were sending up pilots with less than 50 hours of flight time to face American and British veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The engagements were not battles, they were massacres. Speer said there was a moment in late 1943 when he considered approaching Hitler with the truth that Germany could not win. That American production made victory mathematically impossible. That the war should be ended through negotiation while Germany still had leverage, while German forces still held territory before the Reich was completely destroyed. But Speer did not have the courage to speak those words. Hitler still believed in wonder weapons and secret projects that would reverse Germany's fortunes. The V-1 flying bomb, the V-2 ballistic missile, advanced jet fighters, new submarine designs. Speer knew none of these weapons would matter. You cannot win a war with technological advantages when the enemy is producing conventional weapons at 10 times your rate. But he kept that knowledge to himself and kept the factories running. Men kept dying for a cause that was already lost. On May 20, Nitze asked Speer about Hitler's Nero Decree, the Scorched Earth Order from March 1945. With defeat inevitable, Hitler had ordered the destruction of all industrial facilities, transportation, infrastructure, utilities, anything that might be valuable to the advancing Allied armies. Germany itself was to be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands intact. Speer said he had disobeyed the order. He claimed he transferred his loyalty from Hitler to the German people and the future of the German nation. He sabotaged implementation of the decree, ensured that critical factories and bridges were not destroyed, tried to preserve what was left of German industrial capacity for post-war reconstruction. It was a good story. It made Speer sound like a humanitarian who had broken with Hitler at the end. Whether it was entirely true was debatable, but it would help Speer at his trial. It would allow him to present himself as the Nazi who tried to limit the destruction, who thought about Germany's future, who was different from the fanatical nihilists around Hitler, who wanted to drag Germany down with them. On the morning of May 21, Nitze received a message from his military liaison officer. The Americans were planning to arrest Speer and the other members of the Flindberg government on May 23. They would be handed over to Allied authorities for war crimes prosecution. If Nitze had any remaining questions, he had less than 2 days. Nitze asked Speer to describe Hitler's final days in the Berlin bunker. Speer provided details. He had visited Hitler on April 23, 1945, one of the last people to see the Führer alive. He described a broken man, physically deteriorating, trembling, ranting about betrayals, issuing impossible orders to armies that no longer existed, convinced that willpower alone could still achieve victory. Hitler believed to the end that German spirit would overcome material disadvantage, that determination, courage, and ideological conviction could defeat American bombers and Soviet tanks. Speer said it was madness. Spirit does not stop bombs. Willpower does not manufacture fuel. Determination does not build tanks. On May 23, exactly as predicted, British and American military police arrested Speer and the other members of the Flindberg government aboard the ship Patriot during a meeting that had been arranged under the pretense of negotiation. Tanks surrounded Glucksburg Castle. Armed troops entered Speer's quarters and informed him he was under arrest. Speer reportedly said, "So now the end has come. That is good. It was all only kind of an opera anyway." He was transferred through a series of detention facilities, eventually arriving at Nuremberg, where the International Military Tribunal would try him, alongside 23 other senior Nazi leaders. Nitze and Galbraith moved on. They compiled their findings into reports. The Strategic Bombing Survey would eventually publish its conclusions in September 1945, over 200 volumes for the European theater alone. The essential findings were clear. Strategic bombing had been decisive in defeating Germany, but not in the ways pre-war airpower theorists had predicted. The attacks on German civilian morale had largely failed. The Germans had endured bombing with remarkable resilience. Cities were destroyed, but factories kept producing. Workers showed up despite having their homes destroyed, despite food shortages, despite everything. The attacks on ball-bearing production, on aircraft factories, on many of the precision targets that Allied planners thought were critical had achieved limited results. Germany had worked around those losses through dispersal, redundancy, and substitution. But the campaign against oil had worked. The systematic destruction of synthetic fuel plants from May 1944 onward had crippled the Wehrmacht. Without fuel, Germany's military effectiveness dropped by approximately 80% in the final months of the war. Speer's production miracle became meaningless. You can build tanks and aircraft, but if you cannot fuel them, cannot move them, cannot train operators to use them, they are useless metal. The survey estimated that the oil campaign had shortened the war in Europe by months, had saved countless Allied lives, and had proven that strategic bombing could be decisive when properly targeted. Nitze took those lessons to Japan. He was reassigned to the Pacific Strategic Bombing Survey Team in July 1945. He arrived in Nagasaki in September, shortly after atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He walked through ruins that made Berlin look almost untouched. He examined destruction that exceeded anything conventional bombs had achieved. He interviewed survivors who described what no human should ever have to describe. The survey's conclusions for the Pacific theater would eventually argue that Japan had been on the verge of surrender even without the atomic bombs, primarily due to destruction of its merchant fleet and severance of supply lines from the resources of the occupied territories. Just as Germany had collapsed without fuel, Japan was collapsing without the raw materials its industries needed. The mechanism was different, but the principle was identical. Modern industrialized warfare cannot be sustained without resources, and an enemy with overwhelming naval and air superiority can cut off those resources. The interrogation of Speer shaped American defense policy for decades. Nitze would serve in nearly every presidential administration from Truman through Reagan. He helped design the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Western Europe. He was the principal author of NSC 68, the foundational document of Cold War containment strategy. He negotiated arms control treaties with the Soviet Union. He advised presidents on nuclear strategy. He spent 40 years at the highest levels of American national security decision-making. But he never forgot what Speer told him in May 1945. That modern wars between industrial powers are ultimately won by the side with greater productive capacity. That material superiority, when sufficiently overwhelming, determines outcomes more reliably than strategy or tactics or courage. That America's ability to outproduce any rival was its greatest strategic advantage. Albert Speer was convicted at Nuremberg of war crimes and crimes against humanity, primarily for his use of slave labor in armaments factories. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment at Spandau prison. The tribunal noted his efforts to sabotage Hitler's scorched earth decree and acknowledged that Speer had been one of the few Nazi leaders to accept personal responsibility for the regime's actions, though that responsibility was carefully limited to avoid admitting knowledge of the Holocaust. He served his full sentence without parole and was released on October 1, 1966. He published 2 memoirs that became international bestsellers and maintained his carefully constructed image as the apolitical technocrat who had been seduced by Hitler's charisma but had remained fundamentally decent. This narrative, known as the Speer myth, dominated his historiography for decades. Only in the 1980s and 90s, when historians gained access to documents Speer had hidden, did the full truth emerge. He had extensive knowledge of the Holocaust. He personally expanded Auschwitz. He knew exactly what was happening to Jewish workers in his factories. His entire post-war story was a carefully constructed lie designed to evade the death penalty and rehabilitate his reputation. But in May 1945, Nitze did not know this. He knew only that Speer had provided the information the strategic bombing survey needed. Speer died in London on September 1, 1981, at age 76 while visiting the United Kingdom. His death prompted obituaries describing him as the good Nazi, the one who accepted responsibility, the architect who became a reluctant war criminal. These obituaries infuriated Holocaust survivors and historians who knew the truth. Nitze died on October 19, 2004, at age 97. His obituary in the New York Times described him as one of the architects of American Cold War strategy, a man who helped shape 50 years of foreign policy. It mentioned the strategic bombing survey in a single paragraph and did not mention what Speer told him about American production eclipsing German capacity. The strategic bombing survey reports remain in archives studied occasionally by military historians and defense analysts. The findings on oil targeting influenced air campaign planning in subsequent wars, though commanders often ignored the lessons about what does not work. The Vietnam War saw American bombers repeat many of the same mistakes that failed in World War II, targeting infrastructure and morale rather than focusing on resources that could not be replaced. The Gulf War in 1991 returned to the survey's principles, with planners targeting Iraqi oil production, electrical generation, and transportation networks while avoiding indiscriminate city bombing. The campaign succeeded in its objectives, and military historians credited careful study of the strategic bombing survey findings. Modern strategic analysts still debate what defeated Germany, Soviet manpower that ground down the VAT. On the Eastern Front, Allied strategic bombing that destroyed German infrastructure, Hitler's strategic blunders, the cracking of German codes that gave Allies critical intelligence advantages. Every factor contributed. But Speer told Nitze the answer in May 1945. Germany lost because American production exceeded German production by ratios that made German defeat inevitable. 2:1 in aircraft, nearly 2:1 in tanks, 10:1 or more in naval vessels. Overwhelming superiority in trucks, artillery, ammunition, every category of military equipment, and there was nothing Germany could do to match that output. The rural industrial region was Europe's manufacturing core. German engineering was world-class. German workers were skilled and disciplined. German scientists developed jet fighters, ballistic missiles, and nearly achieved nuclear fission. None of that mattered when facing an adversary who could produce 5 fighters for every one Germany built, who could replace every sunken cargo ship with 2 more, and who could land 1 million soldiers on a hostile beach with full logistical support because the industrial base could sustain them indefinitely. This was the revelation Paul Nitze carried from Blocksberg Castle in May 1945. Not just that strategic bombing worked when it targeted oil that was tactically significant. But strategically, the larger lesson concerned industrial capacity as the foundation of military power in modern warfare. America had demonstrated a form of economic might that no rival could match without fundamentally transforming their entire economic system. The Soviet Union understood this lesson. Stalin's post-war industrial buildup was designed explicitly to rival American productive capacity. The nuclear arms race was partly driven by this insight, if you cannot match American conventional production, develop weapons to offset numerical disadvantages. Soviet industrial expansion in the 1950s and 1960s was an attempt to build a productive base capable of sustaining conflict with the United States. It failed. The Soviet economy collapsed in 1991, unable to sustain both military spending and civilian living standards. China drew a different lesson from analyzing World War II production statistics. Instead of trying to outproduce America through centralized planning, China integrated into global trade networks, attracted foreign investment, built manufacturing capacity as the world's factory, and then used economic growth to fund military modernization. By 2020, Chinese industrial output exceeded American production in many sectors. Whether this translates to military advantage in any future conflict remains uncertain, but Chinese strategists studied the strategic bombing survey and understood what Speer had told Nitze. Wars between industrial powers are won by the side that sustains production longer, replaces losses faster, and brings overwhelming material advantage to bear. The core findings of the strategic bombing survey remain relevant. Target resources that cannot be replaced, recognize that civilian morale is far more resilient than pre-war theorists assumed, understand that industrial dispersal and redundancy can mitigate even heavy bombing. Ultimately, modern warfare is a contest of industrial capacity. The side with more factories, more resources, more workers, and superior production systems prevails if other factors are roughly equal. This was what Nitze learned from 7 days of interrogation in May 1945. Germany could not win because America's material superiority was mathematically insurmountable. Speer had known this since late 1943. He continued producing anyway, because stopping meant immediate collapse. But he knew. And when he shared that knowledge with Nitze, it shaped 4 decades of American defense policy. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, it helps others discover these important chapters of World War II history. Subscribe to stay connected with untold stories from the war, each revealing how the modern world was shaped. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community includes history enthusiasts, veterans, and students from every continent. Thank you for watching and helping preserve these stories.